So good morning, all. That is Massachusetts. It's Plum Island on the North Shore, very close to the New Hampshire and Maine border. That's where I usually am very soon. Hopefully, I will be very soon. But at the moment, I'm looking at a beautiful desert that is in bloom. And I know people that have never seen the desert in bloom don't believe I'm telling the truth, but it is in bloom at the moment. We're going to be talking about the use of AI, and actually, it's more about the decision process. And Deirdre's going to lead us in that conversation. Mark Twain, the two most important days in your life are the day you are born and the day you find out why. And the relevance here is that after having immersed myself in this subject for the past few years, this is more about finding out what AI is and how you use it. What is its purpose? That's the real point here. And then what Professor Silberstein is going to do is talk with us about how do you make decisions about this? How do you make good decisions as a business person, thinking about the fact that these are strategic decisions? So that's what the day is. It's using AI, and these things will unfold over time. Usually we're at the middle to the third week of the month, the 19th of May and the 23rd of June, and then we'll pick back up in the fall. So this subject is about changing our thinking about AI and how to use it and the decision-making process. That's ultimately where it comes to. What is this? What is advanced analytics? And what is the difference between the two? And what is the risk profile difference between the two? And Deirdre will come at it her own way, but that's the way I think about it. And then what is a considered path forward for us in using this technology and framing it? And as you know, I don't care, you may not know, I don't really care if somebody wants to use the term AI and they really are using advanced analytics and it's a good marketing ploy. But for those of us that are technologists and we're talking together, we should be clear about our definition of what we're talking about here. So I want to just spend a second to open this with an anecdote. So this week, I had a conversation with a tech exec, a really good tech exec, a founder, founded a number of companies. He's got a current one underway, and he wanted to talk about his new implementation of AI. So I said, okay, let's get together when you are in the area. Let's get together, or let's get together on Zoom, and let's talk about what I consider the three critical questions of an AI use case. The first one is, and today, in his case, he's using an LLM, or he intends to use an LLM. I said, how do you feed the LLM consistently sufficient and appropriate data for training and production, and then to yield the appropriate and reliable results? How do you do that? How are you going to do it? What's the plan? And those of you that have dealt with this know that there's a big difference between the training and production and the continued learning of the model. And then how will you know and monitor that the results you're getting are reliable and accurate over time, all the way through training, through production? And then lastly, how will you explain the way the LLM has determined the result for each result so that the user can feel comfortable using the result? So let's take a few examples here. So I am actually at the moment helping the Mayo Clinic on using an LLM in their patient care work. I've mentioned this a couple of times before. And I'm helping them not only with the actual use of the algorithms, and the training of the algorithms, but the testing. And I didn't put testing in here, but testing obviously is a critical aspect. And then how are they going to be able to feed it with enough good production data to be able to keep the LLM learning and yielding? And these are where we're focusing. It's on the production and training. It's on reliable and accurate. It's on knowing and monitoring the results, that they're reliable and accurate. And obviously they have a real, everyone has a real stake in that reliable and accurate. And then lastly, how does the user become comfortable? And this is what any of the you that have studied the use cases in this that go back many, many years. One of the original use cases for for this type of learning model was something implemented by IBM with the folks at Georgetown. And they found that that the users loved the idea, but didn't use the result because of the lack of what I call explainability, which is the third point, is they did not have a reliable way to be able to know how the result was determined. So even though the result intuitively felt correct to them, or perhaps slightly off what they had thought, but interesting, they were reluctant to use the result with a patient because they could not go deep enough to understand how is the result determined. So this issue of explainability is a big one. And those of you that have been around me that we've talked about this is something I focus on because it is very difficult, obviously, with the way that the results are determined using an LLM. But so it has to be a separate process that you put in place to develop the explainability. It's costly. It costs a significant amount, and it's a large portion of the cost of the use cases for an LLM, at least today as it exists. So that's just an example. I call that a discouraging and repeated conversation because I've had this with two different founders over the last few months, where they were in fact once we dug into it, using an advanced analytics application, not a true artificial intelligence algorithm, but it was being marketed to them by a very large provider, in this case, two different providers, names that you all would recognize, as a services offering of their platform. And the decision process, as Professor Silberstein will go through, is very different if you're using an LLM versus if you're using an advanced analytics approach. So, Deirdre, I hope that has given you enough to get you started. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you take over.
Share my screen. It doesn't seem to be wanting to give me the opportunity to share my, oh, here we go.
So if it isn't letting you share, why
Correct.
don't you, okay, why don't you send it to me? Well, let me see. Multiple participants can share. So it looks like you have the rights, but don't worry.
Zoom is doing weird stuff with
All
me.
right,
So
just email them to me.
let me
Email them to
email.
me, and while I'm waiting for them, I will let you open up.
Well, I can just start talking a little bit.
Email them to me, and I'll bring them up.
Okay, on its way.
Okay.
All right.
The floor is yours.
So while Professor Cowan is getting this up, let me just start talking. The title of this presentation is How Does a Leader Make Decisions About AI? Well, there's no 10-step process, even though a lot of the literature tries to set out some sort of 10-step process. Rather, the work is far more involved and creative and deep. And I'll go into why it's creative and deep in doing this. It involves leaders and managers operating with full knowledge and analytics in a mode that we've been discussing. That is, we've been building to this discussion of how we set out a decision-making process. We have to pull everything we've been talking about together and move on. And this involves, along the way, how do leaders get the information that will allow them to do the work of figuring out how to use AI? One of the things that Professor Cowan and I have started to do is literature reviews. We've been looking at books, commenting on books, and I'm going to take you through some sort of literature review that will show you what leaders are seeing out there, which is feeding their mindsets, which is informing how they actually go about this work. And then we're going to get into how do they apply what they're learning to a use case in using AI. This is obviously a vast topic. We've already started to joke that I won't get through all of my slides, but I want to make this a bit interactive. I want you to ask questions and contribute because we have already, Professor Cowan and I have already decided to drop in an extra session mid-month so that we can all start to talk about, shift the discussion, not just making decisions about AI, but let's work together to create a use case for the use of generative AI in an entity. And I think using what I'm talking about as a background, that will be an interesting move forward. So with that, here's my cover. Next slide, please, Professor Cowan. I think you're going to have to
Yeah, no worries.
the slides. Okay, these are the things we've been talking about, the 8 characteristics of a great leader, the leadership and management, the mindset of the leader. And today, in action, how does a leader actually do this? What's the basis of knowledge? What are the responsibilities that the leader has to bring into play at both the leadership and management model to be able to make the decisions? And I'm going to say that at the current state, it's close to impossible to do this, except for some very clear cases of established uses below the level of machine learning. Robotics, yes. Deep analytics, yes. Above that, it starts to get very interesting. Next slide, please, Professor Cowan. And these slides are just in review. Here are the 8 characteristics. And I want to point out here that good leaders take full responsibility here. They make effective decisions. They become experts in it. This is how a leader goes forward and operates in any new mode or making any decisions about a topic. Next slide, Professor Cowan. Leadership and management model. We're going to come back to this. So let me take a moment to point out, you've all seen this before, that on the left side, we have the work of the leader. That's the strategic work. And that the leader does is defines the what, when, and why of the organization, then develops the strategy, including vision, mission, operationalizes it with the macro how, the initiatives, the oversight, the adjustment, and then measures the strategy. That's all the strategic aspects. Then over here on the right side, we have what the manager does, the strategy execution, defines how to do it, who's doing it, and so forth, sets the execution plan, sets the plans of action and measurement, sets the budget, and so forth. And the reason I'm using this model as the basis for what I'm talking about is that it goes into depth. That we will see that what the literature talks about, what all of the discussions talk about, the tech companies talk about, is really at a very superficial level and never gets down to this level of depth that leaders and managers need when they actually make decisions about how to use and how to do this stuff. Next slide, please, Professor Cowan. This is, remember, last week we talked about Patrick Bet-David's books. This was the first of our literature reviews. The important point is the need to integrate logic and emotion. The emotional part is that you need to develop a sense that you're doing the right thing. You need to develop a way to understand. You can't just set out a logical agreement, but you need to develop your full sense of what you are doing. And then those of you who have taken classes from me have heard me say repeatedly, my definition of the mindset of a leader, which is based in the knowledge and understanding of the marketplace, the industry, competitors, emerging technologies, customers, business and social factors, and the capabilities of the company. And then leaders constantly refresh this mindset and use this mindset to build strategies, make decisions, and deliver results. The important point here that I want everyone to keep in mind as we start to move through some of the reviews of what's out there is that this is a full concept. It's not just on the technology, it's on the marketplace as well. It's on the business focus, operating in this marketplace and making decisions in terms of the marketplace, in terms of what's going on everywhere in it. And as we will see, all of the information out there is very narrow on, gee whiz, here's a new thing, you've got to use it. So I'm exaggerating a little in that, but I think we'll see how true this is going forward. Next slide, please, Professor Cowan. These are the questions we set out in the announcement of the meeting, and this is the framework of our discussion. How do leaders sort through the information? How do leaders develop a sense? This is the emotional aspect, the guts, the instincts of knowing if they're missing something. And then how do leaders actually decide on AI use cases and implement them? Meanwhile, there are all of these cross currents that leaders are aware of. There's this disruption that technology generally, including the discussions around AI, are bringing into the marketplace and the need for transformation. And I'm going to jump 20 slides ahead and throw out an idea for you to just play with as we're going through this. And that's this, that for the past 10 years, Professor Cowan has been talking about how we're no longer operating on an industrial platform, we're operating on a digital platform. And I'm going to throw out there the idea that if companies are going to truly do AI, truly do what the tech companies, what the academics are talking about, that there needs to be another jump by an organization up to an AI platform, which I'll define throughout the course of this entity. And so that's part of the discussion or part of the decision-making process that leaders have to go through. Is this organization capable of making that jump so that we can go ahead and use this AI? And then there's this whole lack of clarity, consensus, and direction about AI generally. I'm putting it in quotation marks because the term AI is thrown about to refer to anything from turning on a laptop to actual use of AI capabilities. So you always have to be very attuned to the possibility that when someone's talking AI, they may be talking about anything. You have to ask for clarity here. And then there's a deep lack of good, useful information about the uses and implementations of AI. Next slide, please, Professor Cowan. So our questions: what are leaders seeing, hearing, and reading? What information can they use? What do they need then? Given and presaging our discussion, what's lacking in points 1 and 2? And what do they need now so that they can actually do this? And then let's start going into use cases. So next one. And this is what I mentioned before, Professor Cowan and I. So start thinking about when you want to do this. Want to set up another place where we talk together about how do I, as a leader, make a decision about using generative AI way out there on the AI scale in my entity today. And let's just talk this through as a use case. Let's build a use case together. So,
And I have to say, the thing that intrigues me the most about where this could go is the use of adversarial networks, because I really do think that you have to, you don't have to do anything, but you constantly need to be thinking about, I think in this world of using true machine learning, at least in what I've been involved in, you have to look at the reliability of the answer. And you have some interesting possibilities when you get into adversarial networks to be able to test the veracity of what you're dealing with when you look at the data set. So I think that there's a whole understanding about and practice work that but could really be benefited if you really could start developing things with the use of adversarial networks. And I know that they're being used a lot in various cases, but I think the real promise is in pitting the algorithms against each other to try to come up with the most the answer that you're designing for. Let me say it that way. I think it would be easier to ultimately get the answer you're designing for if you can create the adversarial design. So we will want to incorporate some aspect of that in this. And we have some folks. Yeah, I don't see Srinivas on yet, but obviously he spends a lot of time on this subject. We have people on this call that spend their career on this subject that actually know a great deal more than we do. So we intend to enlist their help to have a discussion where we all dig through this and think about the implications. Because when we talk about this, I believe that when you're making that shift from a digital platform to what Professor Silberstein is calling this AI platform, when you head in that direction and you truly adopt that as a technology for your enterprise, I believe you're making an existential decision about your enterprise. I think the risks become somewhat, and even more increasingly existential when you do. And so you have to be truly purposeful about this. And this is why Deirdre's said this really needs to be dealt with by all of us who want to be serious leaders in business over the next 10 to 15 years. Sorry, Deirdre, I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
No. Remember, I want this to be interactive. I want people to ask questions. So,
and not just me.
Okay. Next slide.
All right.
Okay, so let's get into this. What are leaders seeing, hearing, and reading? Now, many of you are tech people, and so you're seeing and reading different things from what leaders are reading. Just keep this in mind. But I guess that most of the technical literature you're reading has to do with technical capabilities, not with what I'll call the decision-making capabilities that a leader, the decision processes. So let's see where leaders are getting their information. There's the business press, and I'll give some examples generally. There are tech companies who are clearly promoting their own interests. Sam Altman, for example, who is, because he's very cute and verbal, is used by a lot of people as an example of what's going on out there. But remember, he's running a for-profit company and he's trying to state the case for his for-profit company. But meanwhile, the business press is picking up all of this. Then you have a lot of other business entities out there. You have the investors, the consultants, the service providers. These are people who are interested in selling. I don't know how many of you are signed up for McKinsey's feeds of information. You should sign up for these because they do very interesting things. But it is so clear when you look at what they're providing, yes, there's some interesting information, but what they're really trying to do is say, look, this is too complicated for you to think about yourself. You've got to hire us at our rates to do this work for you. So just keep this in mind. Then you have the general media, newspapers, magazines. Some of them are tech-oriented, and I'll say like maybe things like the Wall Street Journal has tech sessions, The Economist does a lot of tech writing and so forth. University press releases and publications. Now, this is academic work. And one of the tensions that I'm going to mention several times is between what I'll call the academic work and the business press work. That what I mean here is that a lot of what, say, the business press is picking up is university press releases, but the business press is just quoting. It doesn't know how to analyze or assess, so it provides nothing useful for leaders in assessing what, say, a university says its people are doing deep in some lab someplace. Then we've got these last three things: online forums and demonstrations, social media, conversation. This is all gossip and has to be taken as gossip by people, or any good leader is going to take this as gossip. And you always have to think about what are the motives, objectives, and validity of these sources, particularly in terms of trust, Can you trust any of these? And that includes Sam Altman, by the way. Is their information complete? And is it usable? And this is the big test. Is any of this stuff usable by a leader when making decisions? And that's where we're going to start to focus. How does a leader look at some of this? Next slide, please, Professor Cowan. Okay, so what are leaders actually? The current themes, and I've got these are the upside themes. It's evangelical. It's you need to use AI in your entity. Your people are using it anyway because AI is the greatest thing since the Big Bang. And if you're not using AI or monetizing your data, you're a laggard and your entity will fail. Well, there are two big problems in this. Any leader who hears anyone say, oh, all of your younger employees are picking up tools from the OpenAI site or whatever other sites and are doing experiments with them is going to freeze and worry about enterprise risk. This is massively risky behavior for any organization, any size organization. So while the business press may think this is an upside, for leaders, it's not an upside. But there's something else I want to mention. As I was going through this, I had to think about my own experiences. Many of you know I worked for Deloitte for 15 years, starting in 1987. And I was hired on the basis of my background to work on establishing formal marketing, publications, information processes, both for the US firm and then globally. And then in 1993, think about the dates here, 1993. This is when most people still had desktops, not laptops, or the laptops were sewing machine size. And when I was writing informations for this stuff, my first step said to turn on your computer, reach around the right side and turn on the, that was the stage of computing. But what happened in 1993 was that someone in the tech department found this cool program called Lotus Notes and went out and bought 100,000 licenses for the use of notes by Deloitte globally. Of course, these weren't being used. So management said, my goodness, we've spent all of this money. Who out there can make the company use this? And it became who owns the firm's information? Deirdre owns the firm information. Deirdre gets to make Lotus Notes useful. And that's how I got into the whole knowledge management aspects of things. The reason I'm going into this is that everything here, everything on this slide is everything that was said to me in 1993 about Lotus Notes and knowledge management. This is how leaders hear about all of these new technologies. Back in 1993, knowledge management was the big up and coming thing. It was the Gen AI of the day. And I used to have to go up to Lotus Notes offices, which were right near the MIT campus up in Boston, and sit there, and on would come the evangelicals. Well, we're all saying there, all cool, but what do we actually do? How do we actually use that? So remember that any leaders who remember back to this time, and this is the cohort of leaders who are now in the C-suite roles, in the executive roles out there, are saying, been there, done that, heard this, you've got to prove it to me. Because wave after wave, and I'll show some more of those waves in a moment, they've heard these upsides. Next slide, please, Professor Cowan. Then there are the downsides going against these. Use of data. Well, every leader is hearing horror stories about use of data, privacy, confidentiality, all of the regulations thereof. Then the limitations of the tools themselves, hallucinations. We all know about these things. But then the arguments start to get more subtle and more deep. And more concerning, learning according to their own logic. Now, Professor Cowan and I are bringing in books and so forth. I'm about to bring in the first book, and I'll foreshadow the last 3 slides on this presentation, give you lists of books. But one of the best books being out there, and one people are recommending you read, is this Use of AI by Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt. People who know this stuff. And this will scare the pants off of you when reading about the use of AI. And everyone should read this book, by the way, because it's very good, but it also starts to talk about the subtitle and our human future. And this is Henry Kissinger talking about the use of AI in the direction of warfare. We all know that the militaries globally are now using AI to direct drones, to direct missile strikes, and so forth. We've had some interesting examples lately. But what Kissinger talks about is that we can program these weapons. Our people directing these weapons can use the logic that they have developed, but given the way that AIs learn, there comes a point fairly quickly where we can no longer be sure that the weaponry is using the logic we have set, that is using by our own logic. And Kissinger, being Kissinger, is raising the threat of, and you'll see it down there under the next thing, World War III. But this is something to think about, and it leads into the next point. And this is something Professor Cowan already alluded to, that there's lack of transparency about results. We're hearing more and more about the black box out there. No one knows how algorithms deliver their results. Now, think about this as a leader wanting to make sure, with responsibility for a corporation, knowing that you have to deliver results, you're judged by success. And now people are talking about using tools where there's no transparency about how results will be achieved. Now, how true this will be for an organization is not necessarily understood at this point, but this is part of the leader's mindset in the decision process. And then there's another very interesting point that we're starting to see an awful lot of in the past, say, 3 months. And that's the whole concept of that any algorithm-driven tool actually leads to a regression to a mean. What I mean by that is the way that learning happens is that it regresses to a mean. It's not a way that you get creativity, the way the whole Gen AI industry is talking. It leads to a medium, a mode, a perpetuation of the past. And here's another book for you, and I recommend that everyone read this book too. This has gotten really favorable coverage in the press. And what he is talking about is how the use of filters is just giving people the same old, same old. He's talking about, say, Amazon and Amazon recommendations, or Netflix, or any of the streaming, where they just put in your feeds more of what you have seen in the past, because they're not going to get creative. They're not going to make leaps forward. They're going to expect that they continue to get revenue by giving you more of the things you have already paid for. So from a business leader's point of view, if these use of these algo-driven tools lead to regression of the mean, where's the use case in using them? There was actually a very fascinating study that was reported in a Harvard Business Review, not this latest issue, the issue before, where it talked about how a user using generative AI here now, Gen AI tools, gave several teams of students a project to run using Gen AI and evaluating the results on the basis of creativity. And it actually turned out in all of the cases, the results were same old, same old. They were not creative. They were more of what the entity was already using, not creative decisions. What was really interesting in this is that when questioned, the people using these tools thought they were being 21% more creative. So there's a gap here in what's actually happening and what people think is happening. So these are things to think about.
So, Deirdre, so spend a sec. This is one of the most interesting but intuitive results, because when you truly understand what these algorithms are doing, they're optimizing. They're optimizing based on the data they've been trained on and the data they're being fed for production and the way the algorithms are written. They are, anybody who's dug into this, there's a really good book called Predictive Machines, right, by the folks up in Canada, written years ago, um, about who had launched the original use cases of AI. And their point is about these algorithms being predictive. Essentially, they're predictive. And so the question then becomes, if they're predictive, they're going to predict the direction of the data that's feeding them. Now, we all intuitively know this because we understand that's what it's doing. But then you come to the conclusion that Deirdre just talked about. You shouldn't expect it's going to come up with a highly unusual answer. It's going to come up with an answer based on the way it's been trained, both in algorithmic terms and also in data terms. So you shouldn't be expecting it to be creative. Now, that you can see why I think that when you start to get into adversarial networks, you could become more creative in the actual result because you're pitting one predictive process against another. So you're more likely, because you're not following just one path, you potentially are following multiple paths. You may come up with an answer that humans wouldn't naturally come up with. But when you study this, and I think you all know I've said this before, when you study this over time, you quickly conclude that machines are, and again, this is all intuitive. We all know this because we're technologists. Machines are really good at structured things. Humans are really good at the unstructured. And when the long-term strategy for this technology has been thought about, that human-machine partnership, 20 years from now, what does that look like? The most reasonable, not reasonable, but the one that sounds the most correct to me is where humans are still dealing with those unstructured aspects of the world that we're dealing with at that time. And they're figuring a way to make all the structured activity in their life and other people's lives easier through the use of these technologies. They're not trying to get these technologies to deal with the unstructured world. Now, there may become a time when you do, and that's when you get into the Kurzweil thing, and can we reach the consciousness level of AI? And that's unfortunately still beyond my pay grade to figure that subject out. But regardless, I think there's an interim step, and we all know that this is, I think this may be round two for AI, right? We all know that AI was first started back in the 90s, and it didn't go very far. And then it's now made a resuscitance. Now, hopefully we now have the power in terms of the ability to amass the algorithms and data and a more sophisticated approach to it that will allow it to now be more successful in the workplace. But these are all, as good technologists, we really need to be digging this deep in this to understand the kinds of things that Professor Silberstein is raising in our awareness when we start to think about making decisions going forward. So I just wanted to bring that aspect back, Deirdre, because I think it's really critical in our decision-making process. We are struggling with this at the Mayo Clinic to try to make sure that we leave the unknown aspect, the unproven aspect to the human beings, the highly trained human beings, and the machines. And I think I've told you before, I've dug through a lot of the answers coming out of the machine and the doctor, and I like both. But when it gets into those cases where it doesn't seem obvious, the doctor has an answer that does not seem to be machine-like. And anybody, if you study like I do, 100 answers at a time, right, from both the doctor and the machine, and you compare them, which is what I have to do one Sunday every year, every month. Not have to, but I do one Sunday every month. You quickly can decide what comes from where. It's amazing. So, but I think we all as technologists, when we're dealing with this critical aspect, I think we have to get that deep. I think we actually have to get that deep. This is too critical. And we have to get that deep. So we're doing kind of what I'm doing. I want to see the answers and I want to prove to myself that I understand. As I've said before, in this particular case, 80% of the time I like the machine's answer better because the machine will take the time to explain the context where the human won't. Because the human will assume that you have, like, Yasir, I'm assuming you have the context, so I'm only going to give you what I think you need, as opposed to having the context helps because I don't deal in your context, Yasir, like you do every day. And you don't deal in mine, right? But you can structure the machine to give you the answer that says, I need to think about Yasir has a different, spends time differently and has a different context. So there's times when that really works better. And I think we have to understand that as the people that are thinking about making these kinds of decisions, which we all know, we've seen what happens in companies that get astray of this, what happens to them. We've all witnessed this in the last, what, Deirdre, 6 months, and I can even limit it to 3.
Yeah.
So again, I want you all to tell us what you're thinking about this, and don't just let us continue telling you what we think. Want to hear from you, and I know, Bob, you're out there, you're dealing with some really interesting stuff these days.
Yeah, I guess I've got just a couple thoughts, but affirming the direction you're going. I've involved, you remember Linda Tedonio, of course,
Oh yeah.
Tom. She sits on 3 different boards, and they're in the 2 of the companies are in the industrial distribution area, and the CEO of one of these firms, and they're making a bunch of acquisitions. They're growing like mad. He sent his leadership team to a conference, AI in distribution. And the message in the conference, to what Deirdre is saying, a lot of it was, start doing things right away, start experimenting, start building your AI muscle. And they asked me to get involved to help them, like, think about what decisions they should make. But I tended to disagree with what they were doing, because I didn't think they knew what they were doing, I guess is the way to put it. So they're implementing an ERP and distribution that has to do with purchasing, inventory, and order entry. They were trying to integrate it with their e-commerce site. They invested in a personalization engine, company called Algonomy. They had Salesforce.com and Google in, and and then they hired a consultant. They paid them 25 grand to come up with a plan of how to build a chatbot for their use case, which was to, sorry, I'm going on a bit here, was to mimic the behaviors and value of a 40-year experienced sales executive, because in this space, it's still 10% of their orders go through e-commerce. So this guy came in, and really all he was doing is it was trying to get hold of their spend with just a standard data analytics piece. And it got so noisy. I ended up, telling that I think they should just pause and figure out what their own, the CEO, to this, the point of this presentation, think of what is going to be sandbox and letting people play around to get educated, and then what are you going to do as a business, because they were just floundering. And then in the company I'm with right now in the learning management space, and the company's being sold, so the new owner here will decide what to do. But we're building AI using Amazon's Bedrock Foundation with Anthropic's Claude, and trying to use retrieval augmented generation to search training materials. So that's a little bit more specific, and they're going carefully. But I was even at a loss, to be honest, of how to help people, just because it's so noisy. And if you're up to speed on the latest, if you call it gossip, Deirdre, which I like, I'm reading things like the State of AI Today and Neuron, all these different blogs, but they're really just like, what's the shiny new toy and what's the biggest LLM that can digest the most tokens. But I think the whole space is, from a leadership perspective, a little bit frozen to act. So it just affirms what you're saying, but that's what I'm thinking as I'm listening to this.
Okay, very interesting. Very interesting. I just keep hearing more and more examples of how, despite what is being said out there, like in the sources of information, that people just don't think they can act, so they're not acting. So we're at that.
And then I see the other side, which is, I also see the other side, which is those people who have convinced themselves, and know better, by the way, who have convinced themselves that they now understand this because they've been indoctrinated by spending 2 days in Vegas at a conference.
Yes.
They're now going to implement this stuff. And they're very proud of the fact that they have learned what they need to learn, and they're now going to move forward. And that I've spent years studying this when it wasn't popular. And I just say, I don't want to overcomplicate this, and I know that Deirdre doesn't either, but she became more and more concerned as over the last 3 months, she's gotten deeper and deeper into, and you all know Professor Silberstein. When she says I've gotten deep on a subject, we know she's gotten deep on a subject, right? I mean, I see you smiling there. Right. She's not only gone deep, but she's gone broad on the subject. And it's, as she said, it's scaring her. And she's seen a lot of technologies that she's gotten involved with. And Bob, I see you opened your mic before you took a drink of coffee, which meant that you had something else to add in this discussion, right?
No, I guess that's it. And
Okay.
is that I think a framework for when and how to make these decisions is what senior leadership is really thirsting for.
Hold on, I've got that. We're coming upon.
We probably ought to move to that soon so that we've got time to discuss it whenever you're ready, Deirdre.
Okay, well, let me move forward here. I want to,
Okay.
mention World War III. Oh, I'm sorry, please go back to the previous, okay. Organizational upheaval. Remember that leaders have to think in terms of alignment and agreement in their organizations to get things done. Leaders think in terms of overall strategy and so forth. So that there has to be a balance here, so that if one area is planning to use some sort of even data analytics, and the use case I've got is a marketing one, which is data analytics, that leaders have to think in terms of, will this create problems organizationally? Where else does this information have to go to make use of this? And can I extend this? And that's our use case. Can I extend? So there's the possibility for upheaval. Bias, I don't need to talk about. We all know about that. The not results wanted is very interesting. Remember, these are all problems that leaders are thinking about. That's why I'm digging into these problems. Have you all heard about the Air Canada case? Up in Air Canada, the Canadian national airline was using a chatbot to give advice to customers on purchasing tickets. And a chatbot quoted to a couple a price for purchasing tickets, and the people went in and did this. And then Air Canada came back and said, no, this was the wrong price. And the couple sued Air Canada and won. That the Air Canada equivalent of the Supreme Court said that if a company uses a chat bot to give information, then the company is responsible for following through on what the chat bot says. Do you not think that this froze a lot of people? Because we all know, we've all had experience in chatbots, and most of it has not been happy. So now think about leaders thinking they are now this is Canada, but it's going to be quoted in the US as well, that now you're responsible for what these hallucinating things are saying to customers, even on things like prices. Enterprise risk, Professor Cowan already mentioned it. I'll simply say that doing any of this stuff is expensive. There are legal risks, bad press. Think about Google and bad press and so forth, with its use of its visual AI. And then there's a new theme that leaders are starting to think about, which is also a little scary. And that's the whole political matters. We're starting to see a lot of articles in, say, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, other business press, about AI becoming a fight between the US and China for world supremacy. Now, how valid this is, I don't know. I'll merely tell you that this book was a New York Times bestseller, and it's very much worth reading. And you can see the subtitle up there, The Technology Power and the 21st Century's Greatest Dilemma. So this is becoming a political matter, global politics. And a lot of multinational corporations and any businesses working globally, and that's a lot of businesses these days, to start thinking about this. So this downside is at the back of every leader's mind when they're making decisions about the use of AI. Now, next slide, please, Professor Cowan. So what are we seeing in the trends of content? Most of these sources are simply perpetuating business as it's done now, simply dropping AI into the title here. It's sort of like, okay, and I've got some examples to give you here. So one is, and this is the Harvard Business Review 2 issues ago, saying that you have to keep your AI projects on track or else they'll go off course. And to do this, you need to do 5 things. You need to select carefully, develop your projects well, evaluate what's happening, make adaptations, and then manage the project well. Well, this is advice that could have been given 50 years ago when talking at the industrial level. But this is what leaders are hearing, and any leader seeing this is going to roll their eyes because they've heard this already. This is all old stuff, and no one is picking up what's new about AI. There's little sense out there about the disruptive and transformative nature. And this is why I'm pushing the idea of an AI platform.
So Deirdre, just go back one more time. Give us the source. That came from?
That came from Harvard Business Review.
Right.
It was actually the November-December issue in 2023.
So think about this. This is an outstanding academic institution, business school, that published in their journal to people like us, right? They want us to read this. They're publishing stuff that fits into what I call the 3 managements, right? Product, project, and change. And they're talking about project management. What they could have said, and I saw, stop, you were nodding, right? Because this is good, just good project management. Well, folks, we should not be thinking about the steps of project management. We should be thinking about the strategy of making decisions. And yes, those are critical. And any of you that have spent time with us know we think those are the 3 really critical management techniques: project, product, and change, that we all have to deal with going forward. But to be told by the Harvard Business Review that when we're making decisions about AI, we as CEOs and founders and entrepreneurs and leaders, we need to be thinking that way, is to me just mind-boggling. And it tells you it makes me think there's a lack of depth going on in the strategic thinking. You know, Bob, you gave a perfect example of good companies that spend a lot of money and they're really just they're just going through a very noisy, as you called it, process. And it seemed more like, in your mind, more like a sandbox. And should they be defining it that way? And should they put limits on what they're doing there and not think about it being a pre-production process? So it just bothered me because when Deirdre got to that issue before I did, and usually does, and told me about it, it troubles me. And then you had repeat examples of that, Deirdre, already this year in their issue, especially the first quarter issue. So
Right.
when you talk about this, is supposed to be one of our most hallowed places for people like us to turn to think about where serious work is going on. But this is something that's published in the Harvard Business Review. So
And I don't mean to pick on them. It's just that this is where a lot of leaders go for the information. And any leader is going to read this and say, yeah, been there, done that, but I'm missing something here. And
but
that's why
then
the
there's
question.
another aspect of this that should bother you all, because almost all of you have a touch to Columbia, right? And for one reason or another, it should bother you that sophisticated business organizations that have trained you in some way or other are putting out this kind of drivel. It should bother you. It bothers me. And we intend to do something about it. But it bothers me that we have our organizations that are supposed to prepare us for strategic decision making and technology, that are feeding us this kind of stuff and expecting us to believe that it is of great value. And I'll stop there. But it's maddening for people like us. And it should be maddening for people like you all, because you all are well schooled, you're well experienced, you're thoughtful people. I know you all. And this just is troublesome to me. And it's bothersome that we've allowed this to occur. And we understand the reasons why. If we understand the history of the Harvard Business Review, we understand why it's gone that way. But it's very troubling that it's harder and harder to get serious work here. And that, I think, Deirdre, is one of the aspects you turned up in the literature review you did. It's very difficult to find serious thinking about this subject. You've pointed a couple of examples, and you have more coming. But
Yeah.
this is the issue here.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump over. I think some of you at this point can fill in some of my slides, and of course I'm delighted to answer questions about this. While we're on this point, I want to jump down to the one content at high level, too high for action, and I'm going to. This is another Harvard Business Review, and this time the author is Thomas Davenport. Some of you may actually know his name. He's a respected author. I've got a couple of his books here. And he started to write about this AI thing. And he wrote an article, and admittedly, he has a book backing this up, which I haven't seen, but this was the article in Harvard Business Review. It was called Stop Tinkering with AI, It's Time to Go All In. And he lists 10 steps for going all in on AI. And I'm going to read through them. And I want you to put your leadership hat on and think about how you, as a leader, having to do this is going to react to be told that it's time to jump all in and you just have to do these 10 things. So here comes. Know what you want to accomplish, work with an ecosystem of partners, master analytics, create a modular, flexible IT architecture, integrate AI into existing workflows, build solutions across the organization, create an AI governance and leadership structure, develop and staff centers of excellence, invest continually, and always seek for new sources of data. Now, as someone who has run companies with profit responsibilities, I'm going, oh my God, this sounds so impossible to do and so expensive. I do not have this resources to even begin to approach this. And that's going to be the reaction of a lot of people who have served in CEO roles or CFO roles or COO roles, that all of a sudden I've got to do all of this. What I've actually just outlined is some of the basis of what I've been calling the AI platform. And there are some other aspects of that, which include things like all of the work on data, all of the retraining, all of building the AI team, which is, by the way, close to impossible. There aren't all that many people out there that people can be hired. It's all of the regulation, all of the processes. This is why I have come to the conclusion that we have to stop even thinking digital platform. If you're going to do this right, you have to go up to an AI platform level. We've spent, and you can read through the rest of these bullet points, especially this latter one. No one's really talking about what other roles are out there for this. Next slide, Professor Cowan. Okay, some more quotes. Again, I don't mean to pick on HBR. I'm just using them as representative, and I assure you that you can find these sorts of quotes across anything that you'll come up with. So this is what leaders are getting out there. A critical question for leaders in all types of organizations: how can you manage employees when the capabilities at their fingertips are constantly changing and the effects of these changes are unpredictable? This is a grab the gut negative reaction on a leader part. Think of auto-sapient, and that's the term that they've started to use for Gen AI. Auto-sapient systems more as co-workers than tools, whatever that means, by the way. Working effectively with auto-sapient systems requires cultivating and maintaining a healthy amount of doubt. Leaders do not want this. Think enterprise risk again. Then, fledgling generative AI systems have huge potential, but are also prone to fabricate answers, invade privacy, and violate IP rights. Given the risks, are leaders best off taking a wait-and-see attitude? Now, this is from the November 2023 and January 2024 issues of Harvard Business Review. And this is what leaders are seeing out there. And then I mentioned before, this is my whole across all of the literature reviews. I have, you can't see them, I have file cabinets over here of articles, so I can pull folders and see what's said across maybe a 20-year period. And one of the points to make here, again, we're talking leadership mindset, is that this stuff comes and goes. That back in 2016, everything was data and analytics. And then people started to talk machine learning, even though they still meant analytics. Then deep learning was mentioned. You don't hear the term deep learning that much these days. Automation imperative, 2018, well, that's late for automation imperative. Sometimes the literature trains. Then VR and AR, which was latest article, not the hit it was meant to be. Now, I know about Apple's new glasses and so forth, but we're really not hearing about VR and AR that much. Quantum computing, 2020, it was big. 2023, started to hear more. But now there's a backpedal, and I know Professor Cowan, and I'm not asking him to jump in at this point because I'm still building an argument here, is very big on thinking that quantum's really the next big thing instead of Gen AI. Then all of a sudden, NFTs, cryptocurrency, and sort of like enough said on that. The metaverse, what's happened to the metaverse? When 2 years ago, everyone was supposed to get in the metaverse. Now Gen AI, and then this fascinated me, 2023, robotics, what's ahead? Firms have been using robotics for a long time now. What I'm telling you here now is that leaders are used to saying, yeah, new technology, whatever, been there, it's going to come, go, whatever. So this is all part of this mindset here. Next slide, please, Professor Cowan. We can actually kind of, I'll just spend 2 seconds on this because you'll get the slides and you can see this. This is what people are seeing out there are very specific applications which may or may not apply. ML for supply chain management. Well, an awful lot of companies have been using analytics for supply chain management for 10 years, if not 15 years. You don't need something like this. Meanwhile, you've got some quaint ones like, let's use data for selecting whiskeys. Okay, fine, cute. But this is the level at which leaders are hearing things. So let's move on, Professor Ken, because time is passing. There's just so much to talk about this, which is why we're going to have to schedule the new thing. The next thing, next slide, please. So this is what information can leaders use if they can. These are all quotes from 2024. Over 80% of the articles discuss problems. McKinsey is telling us that AI can bake in and scale bias, which we don't need. The MIT Tech Review, which by the way is something all of you should be reading. They do news feeds, and the news feeds, daily news feeds, they're free, they're fascinating, and so forth. AI still gets confused about how the world works. Fortune tells us, why do so few businesses see financial gains from using AI? That's very important, because remember what a leader's responsibility is. Stanford Magazine, deceit gets smarter. Can truth keep up? Harvard Business Review again, most AI projects go off course. Economists talking about pseudocognition here. And a lot of people globally read The Economist. And The Economist, by the way, is doing a really good job at keeping up with technology. They're worth taking a look at because they talk more globally about all of this stuff. And they bring in all sorts of technologies, climate tech, infrastructure tech, and so forth. And the New York Times, bringing AI tools to the workplace, move too slowly and risk getting left behind, move too quickly and neither the staff nor the technology may be ready. Well, I know where businesses are going to come in, if they don't want their staff and technologies to be too quickly. Next slide.
Deirdre, why don't we, in a couple of minutes, why don't we spend the last 15 minutes or so opening this up? I'd really love to hear from the rest of these folks on what their reaction to this is. And like you said, you've got probably another 30 slides to go, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I'm only
Right,
halfway.
of material, but and that everyone would find fascinating. It's really tremendous work that she's been doing over the last few months. It's just, this is just the deeper you go, the more you see. One anecdote, when the Mayo Clinic decided they wanted to do the work in the use of true artificial intelligence, they sent one of their doctors to Carnegie Mellon for 1 year to do independent study on the graduate level and came back with a master's degree in the use of artificial intelligence. And he is now leading the effort um, at Mayo Clinic. He happens to be located here in Arizona, which is helpful to me. And I knew him before he left. I had been introduced to him, but that's how serious they're taking it. They actually sent somebody to Carnegie to study the subject and then come back. And Abdul is a serious intellect, as you would imagine, not just a doctor intellect, but a true scientist. But I think we really need more serious people looking at the use case side, which is where he focused. He focused not only on the technology side, but on the use case side of this.
Mm-hmm.
This is really interesting. I mean, Deirdre, you have constantly said to me, and I think, just reaffirming, where do you turn to see the best information to these days on a regular basis?
Actually, Professor Cowan, could I do one more slide? And I'll do it
of course.
because I think there's one very important point to make. And well, a few. So what do leaders all make about this? I mentioned the split between business and academic. And frankly, most leaders are ignoring a lot of this stuff. They're just ignoring it. Oh, I'm sorry. Move on to the next slide, Professor Cowan, which is, okay, what do leaders need? They need the clear and objective information about all of this. Now, this point, and this is the one I've been moving toward, it's the standards of measurement. Now, think about this for a minute. This comes in a number of ways. There are no standards out there for making decisions about the use of tools. What tools could anyone use, even a CIO or a CTO, people who are supposed to be on top of this? And it was actually the New York Times who in the past 5 months have published 2 articles that have even touched on it. And I do not see really any discussion in anything I'm seeing about this except for these articles. And the New York Times in December had an article about what they call the Data and Trust Alliance, which is a consortium of companies which has developed standards for describing the origin, history, and legal rights to data. Now, think about the importance of that for a minute. That if all of this is algorithm driven and all algos depend on data, and now they're just coming up with something for the sourcing of data. You all know how important it is to know which data sets you are using, the validity, the completeness, the source, your legal right to use these data sets. And this is just, but the second point is even more important. And this was an article that was just published, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, which with the title AI has a measurement problem. And this was written by their tech correspondent, who is actually pretty good. And he was talking about how all of these tools are being released now, and there are no standards for comparison. How do you decide to use the Google tool, the Microsoft tool, the OpenAI tool, whatever anyone else is coming up with, to do what? What are they good at? What specific tasks are they good at? What can you use them for? What areas of business, what decisions can they make? How do you even start to approach making decisions about what tools to use? And this article led to a call for some reputable entity, and the article was pointing to NIST, and that makes sense to me, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which I think, by the way, does a pretty good job out there of looking at things. And I think they should be leading this effort of how do you even establish criteria for decision-making about the selection of tools? What are the criteria for selection? And this is a massive problem, and I'm going to suggest that no leader is going to feel comfortable to even proceed with anything beyond data analytics seriously until there are these sorts of standards, the criteria for the selection and assessment of tools. Think about it. You're all tech people. Think about how important that whole thing is. So, and with that, Professor Cowan, and then a lot of the rest of my slides are setting up frameworks for decision making, all based in the leadership and management model, but people can read through those frameworks on their own. Let's, at this point, as you asked for, Professor Cowan, in the last, well, officially about 10 minutes we've got, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on this long, but there's just so much to be said. Open it up to other conversation. Oh, stop. You've got your hand up. Talk.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I just have a question, which is probably more discussional in nature. So in my opinion, AI is about, like, it involves some uncertainty because it's either that the answer itself is uncertain, or the process of obtaining the answer is uncertain, or maybe the format of the answer is uncertain, because like otherwise, it would just be a programmable solution. Like, we don't call a calculator AI just because we know what to expect from it, and that the answer is quite, exact. And yeah, so I think that AI involves some degree of uncertainty. And I'm just curious, like, how can you leverage it? Because like you mentioned the case of the Air Canada company, and the company got sued just because, their AI chatbot was giving false information. But how can you actually be responsible for something uncertain? Like to me, it makes sense that the company should be responsible for their tools, but can they actually control it though? Like, can they do something about it?
Well, there are several ways to answer this. And one is to point to what companies are calling human machine partnerships. that certainly robotics and robotics, where each robot is given a specific task, work in concert with humans to create the actual products. And that's the sort of thing going forward that I think we're going to be seeing, that there has to be a lot more human involvement than the tech companies would get you to believe. Certainly in any marketing data analytics project, people talk about how they're prediction machines, that they make predictions, but then it's up to the human data analyzers, the data analytics process, to take the predictions and turn them into things that can be used by a company specifically. You need to look at the results of the data analytics or the results of the machine learning and figure out how valid it is, and then how it can be applied and how it can be converted into action. And I think there's something more. I think that people in the Air Canada case, clearly whoever was doing this at Air Canada, and I assume they've been fired by now, never thought through all of the dangers of the use of AI. They just automatically assumed that a chatbot would give valid information. So what I think companies have to do is look realistically at the capabilities of these tools. And maybe what the chatbot should have done is said, for this specific information, let me connect you with an operator or something like that. Maybe it could take them through some basic, here are the routes you can take. But then when it comes down to anything contractual, anything factual, they've got to turn it over to humans. So think in terms of human-machine partnerships. And I'll shut up. I'm sure other people have different.
So yeah, let me just explain. I mean, I'm in the middle of this, right, with any use case we're doing. So the way we're doing this is that it's used deliberately about one subject. And this happens to be questions coming from the patient to a general area about their care. Someone triages that. It's usually someone that is at least, most often they're a physician's assistant. So they're one step, they aren't quite a doctor yet, right? But so there could be something in the middle there. They triage the question and decide who is the right skill level to be dealt with. So let's say they look at it and say, this really needs to be answered by a physician. It then runs through the LLM, and the LLM gives an answer. And so what the physician sees is the question from the patient, the LLM's answer, and then a blank space. They have the ability to approve the LLM. They have the ability to modify the LLM. They have ability to tack on to the LLM. So, and only then is it released. But what it did was it kept the physician from having to create the rote answer. And so we found that there are many times when a physician can look at the question and just say, yep, that'll answer it. I've seen that answer before. It'll do it. It'll do the subject. And so it cuts their production time down tremendously, because that's what they spend their time after 5 or 6 o'clock at night doing for hours, is answering patient questions, right? And so that's the way it's being used there. It's not something that you use broadly. You still have to use a human at the beginning to organize the chaos, and then use it to help answer something or do something that's more production oriented, and then give it back to the human. But now this is being employed with life or death kind of decisions, right? What I would tell you, though, that where I've seen the physician stop and completely rewrite the answer is when the question was not well framed. And as a result, the LLM, it can't sort through that. And so I would just tell you where I've seen the worst answers coming out of the LLM. Not that the LLM gave a bad answer, it gave a good answer. It just didn't match what my intuition, and by the way, this is just having looked at now over 1,000 answers about one type of illness. I even know that I think the patient's actually asking something different than what that answer was. And that's where I rejected it. And then later on, I found out, okay, yep, your instincts were right. So that's why I say before we as good technologists should let ourselves get too far in this game, we should be looking at this stuff at that level, right? Because if someone had done that, if someone at Air Canada had sat and said, wait a minute, what are we doing allowing monetization decisions to be made by a predictive analytic answer, right? We can give it frameworks and say, you've got this framework to answer, and God bless, go on, right? But if it got into just open-ended questions, there should be something that intervenes, that deals with the chaos. That's at least my experience. Again, I'm just looking at one use case, but boy, it has turned up so many of these issues of usability and actually the usability and that's why I keep coming back to those three questions because those three questions are constantly now why can they be so useful, why can they be confident because they have almost 100 years worth of data because they've digitized almost everything in their library thanks to IBM actually for doing this. IBM's gone in and digitized all the stuff that was done by hand, read it, digitized it, and put it into systems. So they have all that history. So all the things we would worry about is where's the data coming from? And is it big enough? Is it valid enough? Yeah, it actually is. And boy, some of the other things that turn up, Deirdre was talking about the political side. I would just tell you, I mean, been exposed to this. There are medical things we could do, but we would and would make uh, some dealing with some of the medical issues in less developed countries enormously more scalable and capable, but we can't handle the political aspect because it would go against some of the narratives of the Western cultures these days. And I don't even want to explain to you. I would just say Deirdre knows, and they would be ostracized because it would be viewed that they're taking a position on a subject. They're not taking a position about, they're just saying we could use that to help. So anyway, that's my answer. I don't know if that helps, but that's how I see, and this is just doing it. And I know we have a lot of people out there that talk about this stuff, but are not doing it. And it's very upsetting to me. It really is. We have a lot of people teaching technology that don't do it. And that's also upsetting to me and to Deirdre too. So I want to stop because Yasir, you had your hand up too. And I'll stop. I appreciate your questions. They're always good and they always generate good discussion. So we appreciate that. And as does
Thank you,
Yasir, I
Dr.
didn't even ask this question because we only have a few minutes left, but it's good.
Yeah, it's actually amazing stuff. Like, the information that I just received is like, all the slides. I know like how much word you have, put in behind for that. Thank you, thanks for that. So one statement that I read was that, 80% of the articles are talking about problems. I think that's the problem there. I think they should be talking about limitations. What are the limitations by the AI? And what are the good use cases and what are already, established cases that are there. So leaders, because people go there and they say, oh, this can do that, and then they try to implement everything in their world. That's not true. We are working on a couple of projects, and just like Bob mentioned of one of the projects that, putting 30 years of sales experience into an application and expecting it from that, unlike the example that you gave, Professor, about IBM digitizing everything, you can't actually, and you don't have the experience that salesperson has. You might have the final outcome of sales, but you don't have all the interactions. You don't have all the data that is there. So actually, they started with it, and just like that, I believe it's gonna. If you don't, I don't think you can have, or you have a way of, inputting all the interactions, all the start, all the pitch, everything that the salesperson has done in their 30 years of life to digitize it and have that experience usable. They failed also because they don't have that actually data in there. So they eventually they say, after a month of collaborating, they say you don't have much data to actually do that part.
Yeah.
Or one
Absolutely.
of the examples was about hallucination. So they were trying to put some people that was actually a problem with not having access to the data, and they were trying to solve it with AI, and it was such a simple problem. But of how many movements will be there in next week, and you have to do the resources as per that. You have to arrange the resources. The AI was giving wrong answers because it was the hallucination index was like around like 7 or 8. If you reduce it down, it's just a list of people who will be moving in next week. So you can have done that from that way. If you use AI for that, you just messed up because now it's saying 15 people, and you have arranged all the resources as per that. So you're absolutely right. I think if we can focus on how many use cases are there, how many successful use cases are there, and tell people about that, and what are the limitations. It's more generative AI. It cannot build your dashboards. Like there was like, can it build a dashboard? No, there's some other tools that can do that. This is more conversational stuff like ChatGPT they were trying to involve. So it's like there's a lot out there, and I really, I would like to get access to those slides as well. And of course, I feel like you would put months of effort in that thing. There. Thanks again for that.
No, you're onto some really important point. This point about limitations, thinking about it more in that sense, and then also in terms of established and successful use cases that can be replicated, right? That makes perfect sense. And the whole point about data, I mean, that's as big a deal as anything. We have all the major people. Sloan Kettering is trying to because this is cancer research. I have an interest in that. And that's why they came to me, actually. They said, hey, how'd you like to help on something that might benefit you? I said, absolutely. And look at me, right? I'm still here. But data is a big deal. And that's why, because they don't have the history of data. They want to help, but the question then becomes one of how valid is the data, and does the data really? So they haven't done any of the work that IBM had helped the Mayo Clinic do over the last 10 years in terms of their data. And then and your point about the flow of data, this is something that people that don't deal in this don't get, is there's got to be a flow of data, that you've got the actual designing, you've got the testing, and then you've got the production. And you can maybe get some subsets for design. You can maybe get subsets for testing. But then when you get into production, how are you going to feed it real current data and of the magnitude, and have it properly scrubbed is a bad term, but you understand what I mean, properly organized and properly validated, that it actually is heading the learning machine in the direction you expect it, and you've defined for it to head. And this is all stuff that, unless you dig into a use case, a serious use case, unless you dig into it at the level we're talking about, I think you're not, and I know that you all do. Yes, I know you do. I know Srinivas does. I know there are a lot of you all that do this. Bob has dug into this deeply a couple of times that I know about. You have to be able to do that to truly understand the issues here, because they are a big deal, I think. And I think Deirdre's right. We're going to enter, the world is going to come to an algorithmic world, right? We're already pretty much there. The question is, how much learning do we allow that algorithm to do? And how much prediction do we allow it to do? And, that, and I know that there are people that are trying to keep us on the edge there. Kurzweil, he was fascinating on Rogan recently. And, Elon Musk on Rogan, you can really understand where his brain's going. Not really. You can get a sense of where his brain is going when you sit and listen to him for 2.5 hours when he's smoking marijuana and talking to Joe Rogan. I mean, you do kind of understand, where this is fascinating stuff. And there's some really interesting people doing some really interesting thinking here. But I think your point about understanding the use cases, understanding the successful use cases, and why are they successful, and how could that apply to my company? I think Bob, I think you could, if you had seen a way to be able to get that infused into the company that you were trying to help, you wouldn't have stepped back and said, I think this needs a little bit more work.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the next set of sessions. I love the idea of a platform because that speaks to frameworks. And then I think of the audience that I have and I'm about to have. There's the company itself, especially if you're leading the technology company, and how do you leverage AI for language and code for effectiveness? How do you put that into your products? You then need to have that approach for investors or the board before they beat you to it, right? Because they're thinking about how you should go about it. And then how do we also talk about the executives whom we serve, our customers, and give them a framework for making these sort of decisions? So I see all of this really helping there a lot.
I appreciate that, and I really appreciate the fact that you all are here live. I'll borrow you too. We haven't heard from you today, but I'm assuming you are sitting back and taking this in, as you usually do. So just to the point now of where does this go, right? And we haven't heard from Nahida today, but we know she's got thoughts because she always does. She's just deep thinking, Deirdre, and deep learning. Right?
Yes, it's a fascinating discussion, and I'm enjoying it. I'm learning a lot, and I need to study more. And thank you for the books. But I am very novice, unfortunately, in this area.
That is a
thank you.
Let me just tell you, this is a modest intellect. This is a professor from Carnegie Mellon, right? So just so you all know,
Thank you.
that is a modest view of her capabilities, and she could be tremendously valuable to us. But so on Tuesday, you'll get a notice that we're launching a new business called Deep Business. Deirdre and I are. And our first initiative is going to be down this whole path, as Bob predicted for you all just a minute ago, and Yasir has. That we're going to be launching an initiative to go deeply on the use of AI and the use cases of AI and do exactly, Yasir, what you are talking about, is to teach ourselves how to deal with this and do it through building use cases. And it was interesting that you've come to that conclusion, because that's exactly what Deirdre did over this whole time. She just said, until you come to the point of studying a valuable use case, you're not going to be able to truly understand this. So you'll see the announcement. We'll ask you all, we'd love to have you to help us do this. And we're going to involve some other people that we know have been involved in this that usually are here on Sundays. And we're going to be launching that on our own platform to be able to have these discussions. And we have still a little bit of logistics to figure out, but we will do this. So we have overstayed our welcome, and you all are still here, and it's now way past, and you all need to enjoy the weather. Hopefully it's good where you are. I know some of you it is.